Hey y'all, it's Mr. Delot again. We're going to keep going with our World History AP discussion of Communist China and Mao Zedong in the 60s and 70s. We're going to talk about the Cultural Revolution. We're going to get into the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and a few things with Iran, as well as land reform in a few other parts of the world. So here we go. Anyway, where we left off with Mao, we had just seen the Great Leap Forward fall flat on its face, right? They were forced to abandon it by about 1960 because so many people were dying from the famine, and Mao's steel production was a failure. And as far as Mao's control over China goes, he's trying to build up, remember, that personality cult just like Stalin did. He's trying to get absolute control over information, over the people. He wants the loyalty of the people who are being essentially brainwashed, right? Indoctrinated from a very young age into this cult of personality for Mao. But even still, by the mid to late 60s, Mao is losing his grip a little bit on the Communist Party and on China as a whole. So he needs to do something to kind of reinvigorate his hold over the country, to reinforce his power and to essentially recommit the country to communism. And that's going to be the Cultural Revolution that starts in 1966. And this is going to be a lot like what Stalin does with his purges in the Soviet Union. Mao's going to use this to silence any and all of his critics, and it's basically, like I said, a round of political purges. One way that he does this is Mao creates the Red Guards, which is a group of revolutionary students who violently purged China of anybody that Mao thought was counter-revolutionary or in any way not committed to communism and to Mao's rule. And these Red Guards, again, mostly students, would go in and they would report people. They would seize teachers, government officials, professors, their neighbors. These kids even reported their own parents a lot of the time. And these people that got reported and arrested would be sent to brutal re-education camps, labor camps where they'd have hard labor and usually die from overwork. And then there's also repeated massacres in China during the Cultural Revolution of anybody who's, quote, not revolutionary enough, and anybody who was considered to be a political dissident or a class enemy was also sent to the re-education camps or just outright murdered. And it gets so bad that when it's all said and done, the Chinese government admits to about 250,000 deaths. Okay? The real total is probably upwards of 20 million. Because as we talked about with a few other genocides and things like this, if it's a communist government or a dictatorship, if they're admitting to thousands of deaths, the real number is certainly higher than that. And like I say, experts agree that it's about 20 million people all told that die in the Cultural Revolution. And as far as China's relationships with other countries, by the time that Mao is on his way out in the 60s and 70s, China has had a split with the Soviets. They were closely allied with the Soviet Union until about 1961 when some border skirmishes had broken out between China and the Russians. And there's also some competition for global influence and domination between the Soviets and the Chinese, right? Like there's an alliance with Albania that China makes, where Albania chooses China over the Soviet Union as its main patron, and the Soviets don't really like that. And China was also allowing some limited business freedoms later on in the 70s especially because they didn't want to avoid the business collapse and the economic collapse that the Soviet Union was going through. Right? They realized with hardline communist economics, they weren't going to make any money, and so they started to kind of change things a little bit with their economic system, especially after 1972 when Nixon went to China with ping-pong diplomacy and all that, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But even today, China and Russia kind of flip-flop back and forth between being tenuous allies and being major rivals. Usually, China also has relations with the U.S. and India as well, but it's the same situation where sometimes China and the U.S. really get along, sometimes China and India really get along, and then depending on the day, they have major rivalry that breaks out over naval competition, over islands in the South China Sea, over economics, all sorts of things. But anyway, moving right along to what's going on in Iran, there was a lot of turmoil in Iran politically and economically over foreign influence, okay? And European countries especially had been very involved and interested in Iran since before World War I because oil had been discovered in Iran. And y'all know that today, right? The Persian Gulf is one of the largest oil reserves in the world, and Iran sits right on top of it. And during World War II, The Iranians were leaning a little bit towards supporting the Nazis, and so Britain and the Soviet Union kind of did a joint invasion where they split it. They split Iran north and south. The Soviets took about the top third, the British took the rest, and after the war was over, they were supposed to leave. But as we saw in Eastern Europe, is Stalin going to pull out troops? Of course not. It was a big fight to get the Soviets to move their troops out of Iran after World War II, and so there was a lot of tension already early on in the Cold War over this. But anyway, eventually the Soviets do leave, and the British and Soviets and the U.S. all kind of agree to install this guy as the Shah, a dude named Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And we had already kind of overthrown his father. That was an Allied operation. But he's really unpopular with the people. He's running Iran kind of as a dictator, and so he's overthrown by his people in 1951. They exile him. They think he's a Western puppet. They think he's corrupt. And instead, they elect a prime minister in Iran called Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. And the only problem with that, even though this is a democratically elected prime minister, is that he has plans to start nationalizing certain industries in Iran, like oil specifically. And Britain and the U.S. can't let that happen. So to avoid losing control over Iranian oil, they engineer another coup and restore Shah Pahlavi to the throne. But again, it's not something that is really the U.S. and Britain support democracy, right? They're supporting somebody who's running the country like a dictator because he's friendly with us and because he doesn't want to nationalize the oil. Good for business, good for politics. We don't really care that he's not a democracy. And the Shah does have a ruthless regime. He has an efficient secret police force. There's almost no political rights in the Shah's Iran. But again, he's friendly with the West, and there's economic and religious freedom in Iran as well. So it's nowhere near as bad as some of the other dictatorships around the world, because there was economic freedom, there was, for the most part, religious freedom in Iran under the Shah. It was just certain other rights that the people didn't have. And he does institute a lot of progressive reforms peacefully during his reign, and he's going to institute land reform as well during what's called the White Revolution. Because, for one thing, the Shah starts to turn Iran towards secularization, right? Turning away from Islamic law, Islamic rule. And they were the first Islamic country to allow women's suffrage, which is a big deal. And yeah, the Shah didn't really allow a whole lot of political rights in terms of, like, you know, what you're voting on actually getting anything done. But people were allowed to vote and women were allowed to vote, which is a huge deal. Because in other Islamic countries, like Saudi Arabia, for example, women have essentially no rights, and Iran is one of the first countries to change that. In the White Revolution, the Shah also creates several social welfare programs to help people out. He fixes up the Iranian schools, increases the literacy rates, and there's also massive land reform to try and increase his popularity. He's not really doing it out of the goodness of his heart, but he does try to get the peasants on his side and break the power of the old, like, aristocracy, the old landowners in Persia. Basically what he does is the government buys up massive tracts of lands for super cheap from all these landlords that they don't really have a choice but to sell to the government, and then they resell all the land for a very low price to the peasants to basically redistribute it. Same way we've talked about in Mexico and a few other places. Except this is the government selling the land to the peasants after they buy it. And the result here is that thousands of people in Iran become new landowners. Right? There's essentially a middle class created out of this in a lot of ways, but even with all the reform, the majority of people still didn't have their own land, and the landowners who lost their land also hated the reforms. The peasants that got left out, they hated the reforms, and this isn't going to do the Shah really any favors in keeping his popularity up. There are a few people that get really happy over this, but overall, it's unpopular. And so he's got that issue, and then there's a lot of people that want more democracy because they don't like that the Shah has essentially absolute power. And so the end result here is that, you know, he's got too many people that are against it, right? All the ones we were just talking about. Religious conservatives don't like modernization, westernization, secularization. There's a lot of more conservative religious people in Iran that don't like the women's rights. That was especially something contentious that is going to cause the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And the Iranian Revolution is an Islamic revolution. It's led by a guy named the Ayatollah Khomeini, who rules Iran as basically a theocratic dictator after 1979. And everything that he does is based on reestablishing Islamic rule, a theocracy in Iran. He rejects Western influence, he rejects secularization and secularism, and makes an Islamic theocracy as a key part of the Iranian government. Okay, it's an absolute government with the Ayatollah at the top. There's religious control over pretty much everything, everybody's personal lives. The citizens' day-to-day decisions are governed by Sharia law, and is also essentially a complete end to women's rights in Iran. And it kind of doubled down on Islamic law, Sharia law. The Constitution and they had a ruling council as well, were all based in that law from the Quran, with constant checks by the government on compliance with the law, right? Like if they found out that your wife, for example, had been leaving the house without a male relative, that could lead to serious repercussions for her and maybe even for her husband. But this revolution is the thing that brings us to the modern Iran that we have today, the one that opposes the West, opposes Israel. I mean, it's a relatively common occurrence, almost daily an occurrence, that you have the Ayatollah coming out and making speeches where he calls the United States the Great Satan, where he calls Israel the Little Satan. And because of this rejection of Western influence, Iran is also one of the major countries in the world today that supports terrorist groups, right? Extremist Islamic terrorist groups. The Ayatollahs fund and arm plenty of terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS. And speaking of, like, if y'all remember at the beginning of 2020 when everybody was worried about World War III because there was a U.S. drone strike that killed an Iranian general, that was all related to this funding of terrorism that Iran does. Like Soleimani, the guy that we blew up, was Iran's top general, but the only reason he was in Iraq in the first place was because he was bringing money and weapons to terrorist groups, to ISIS, and so that's why we blew him up. Anyway. That supply of terrorist groups by the Ayatollah's government does still continue right now. But we'll go ahead and shift gears a little bit and get into some more land reform, because the land reform in Iran sort of kept going with the Ayatollah because he does need the peasants on his side, but for the most part he just focuses on building his own power. Now we're going to move to Latin America. And if you remember us talking about Mexico and land reform there in the 1930s, land reform in Latin America is still a vital part of what governments get up to, okay? Mexican reforms in the 1930s are really important, but a lot of land reform in Latin America doesn't happen until a little bit later, till the 1960s or later. And so real quick to just run through a couple of specific ones that you may see on the AP test. In Venezuela, the government takes a bunch of government-owned land, about 5 million acres, so a crazy amount of land, and redistributes it, mostly land that they had taken from large landowners, similar to what happened in Iran. And they started doing this really in 2001 under Hugo Chavez and his regime. But it was also incredibly unpopular, right? Like all the landowners that are having their land seized and given to the peasants, they don't like that. But it gets Chavez popular enough with the peasants that he manages to stay in power. There's also a few issues like over like squatting, like there were squatters living on land that wasn't theirs. That was a pretty rampant problem in Venezuela. And the land that they lived on tended to be government land that wasn't earmarked for redistribution. And so there wasn't really anybody who owned it, but even today there's still an issue with that, with people that they aren't homeless, but the land they live on isn't theirs. It belongs to the government. And since we're on the topic of Hugo Chavez, he gets elected as president of Venezuela in 1999, and he holds power until he dies in 2013. Okay, he's considered to be part of what's called the pink tide in Latin America, which is this big swing to the left that a bunch of Latin American countries make, where they start to try out socialism, essentially. And this is going to be mostly an early 21st century thing that a lot of countries, Venezuela would be one of the biggest examples, where they elect socialist governments, and some of them try a bunch of reforms, and they kind of work. In Venezuela, Chavez just more or less turns into a socialist dictator, and for the most part, he's a failure. Venezuela today has one of the worst economies in the world, and probably the worst economy in the Western Hemisphere. Anyway, in Guatemala, we have another guy named Jacob Arbenz, who is, again, democratically elected at first, and he also starts to move towards land reform. Now, this is earlier than Chavez. This is back in the 1950s. Arbenz is there from 1951 to 1954, but like we saw in Cuba, American businesses start to feel threatened, and a group called the United Fruit Company feels like its business is in jeopardy, so it lobbies the U.S. government to overthrow Arbenz, which of course we do. We're not going to let him threaten American business with nationalization and land reform. So the CIA sends in a group. They overthrow his government in 1954. And so the lesson here is not to go socialist or threaten American business interests, because if you do, the CIA will go in and take care of you, right? Do you want to keep your communism, or do you want to keep your kneecaps? That's the CIA deal. And then real quick, just to recap Mexico under the PRI. We talked about him already, but Lázaro Cárdenas had started land reform in Mexico from 1934 to 1940, and that party continues to control Mexico all the way till 2000, but for the most part, land reform stops in Mexico after about 1946, and there's a couple of things they do in the 1960s, but land reform is officially, quote, declared dead by about 1970, and there hasn't been that much change since then. All right, thank you all for sticking with me this long. This is a long video, but we're going to go through really quickly some land reform in Vietnam, Ethiopia, and India. So in Vietnam, remember, they get independence right after the Japanese leave in 1945. Then they get independence from France by 1954 with the Viet Minh and Uncle Ho and all of them. But for the most part, Vietnam is an agricultural society still in the 50s and later, right? There's a landowning elite that controls most of the land, and that's how the communists got popularity, was by promising land reform, right? North Vietnamese communists come in and they violently enforced land reform and other nationalization programs too, but they came in and anybody that resisted the government seizing their land would be shot, just like we saw in the Russian Revolution, just like was happening in China. And one of the big weaknesses for the South Vietnamese government was that they were really sluggish when it came to land reform, which made their government unpopular with the people. It's one of the reasons that we had the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. It was South Vietnamese who were essentially communist guerrilla fighters who would go and join up with the communists because they wanted land reform and other changes from the South Vietnamese. In Ethiopia, the guy who returns to power in 1941 is Haile Selassie. He's going to be the king of Ethiopia, and he comes back in during World War II. He successfully kicks out the Italians. He allies with the Western powers against the Nazis and the Italians. And under his rule, for the most part, Ethiopia is going to flourish. They have a pretty sizable coffee trade. They have a lot of trade with the West that opens up, and so they start making money. Their economy starts to build up. And that Western alliance, initially at least, really pays off, which of course also leads to Western influence, Western-style political changes, economic reforms. But overall, there's not a whole lot of land reform in Ethiopia, okay? Which, that's just because they stay capitalist, right? The people who own the land keep owning the land. And Haile Selassie gains a reputation as essentially an imperialist puppet of the U.S. and Britain. The people in Ethiopia feel about Haile Selassie very similarly to the way that the Persians felt about the Shah. They think that the West has way too much influence, and that's something that's going to come back to bite him. He gets deposed in 1974 in a coup led by a guy named Mengistu Haile Mariam, who is not related to Haile Selassie, but he was a general. There's a military coup, and when Mariam takes over, he declares a socialist government, starts nationalizing everything, and he also has 60 of Haile Selassie's old officials from the old government. He has them assassinated, and he swings Ethiopia hard to the left. He allies with the Soviet Union and the communist bloc because he needs weapons. He gets a little bit of economic aid. He gets a lot of military support. And of course, this doesn't turn out well for Ethiopia or its economy, right? It fails. There's widespread famine and economic failures that follow the switch to communism. And because of the failure, when the Soviet Union collapses, Mariam has nobody to back him up, to support him, and so he's forced to resign in 1991. And Ethiopia eventually starts to make some more reforms and things and head back towards democracy and capitalism, and they're better off for it nowadays. Now, last thing for India, we've talked about this a little bit, but the partition of India, right, when they split India into India and Pakistan in 1947, both of those new countries struggled to establish successful economies because after the imperialism, with the aftermath of the British economy and everything, it's going to be hard to build up home industries that are independent of Europe. And a big part of that is going to be the situation with land ownership in India. And the Indians do implement some land reforms, but the place that really kind of pioneers this for India is going to be one of their states, okay? They have certain Indian states like Kashmir, and one of them that really does a lot of land reform is going to be Kerala. And the Kerala state government implements some land reform, some socialist policies, like in 1960. In 1960, they overturned most of the land reforms that they had done, but a lot of them worked and were really popular with the people. Okay, and so some of those reforms in Kerala end up getting adopted by the Indian national government, right? Like in 1963, they make a few laws that give rights to tenants, where tenant farmers were allowed to purchase land for the first time and could legally become the full owners of their land by like 1969. In 1974, they passed a bunch of reform for workers' rights in Indian factories, which by this point are becoming much larger in the Indian cities. They passed minimum wage laws, they lowered the hours, they raised the pay. Things just generally start to get better. But the central government steps in to roll back most of the reforms here, and trying to stem the tide of communism and socialism, most of these things get shot down until later on, right? Like Kerala pioneers a lot of it, but the Indian government rolls back the reforms. Anyway, that's where we're going to go ahead and stop it. That'll be it for section 8.4, and we'll keep going with our discussion of decolonization after 1900 later on.